She's moving in Saturday at 11. Be sure the closet is cleared and the passcode ready. That was the text from my father. No questions, no discussion, just a declaration delivered like a dinner reservation. Except what they were reserving was my apartment, my sanctuary. The home I spent 6 years of side gigs, silent sacrifices, and self-doubt, building into something that was finally mine. And now, without a single conversation, they'd assigned it to my younger sister, Nina, because she had just broken up with her boyfriend and needed a fresh start. What they didn't know was that I had a plan of my own, one they would never see coming. I'm Elena Carter, 32, quiet by nature, determined by necessity. I work in data analysis, which means I spend my days finding patterns and asking questions. But nothing in my spreadsheets ever prepared me for the emotional algorithms of family, especially mine. Growing up, the middle daughter in a traditional expectations-heavy household meant being fluent in one thing, quiet compliance. My older brother was the achiever, Nina, the sensitive one, and me, I was the glue, the fixer, the one they didn't worry about because I always figured it out until I didn't, or rather until I chose not to. This story isn't just about real estate. It's about respect, the kind that families often forget to give to the ones who never demanded it. It's about boundaries, not the kind marked by walls and doors, but the kind we draw in silence when no one is listening. And it's about growth, the painful, beautiful kind that comes only when you stop asking for permission to be seen. If you've ever had your space taken, your choices overwritten, or your voice muted by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, stay with me. This isn't a revenge story. It's a blueprint for anyone learning that saying no might be the first real act of love you ever show to yourself. Let's begin. To most people, it was just a 2-bedroom walk-up in a quiet corner of Seattle. The floors creaked in the morning. The oven ran a little too hot. The windows collected mist like clockwork by 7 a.m. But to me, that apartment wasn't just a space, it was a timeline. Every inch of it held a memory of something I had once doubted I could reach. The lease I signed with trembling hands. The paint I chose after 3 trips to the hardware store, questioning whether soft sage really felt like home. The bookshelf I built alone one rainy Sunday after work. Those bricks, those walls, they had names. Grit, growth, grace. I bought that place after 6 years of living paycheck to paycheck, splitting bills with roommates who came and went like seasons. I took freelance contracts on top of my full-time job, sacrificed weekend brunches for spreadsheets and server logs. I didn't just earn a home, I built it. One coffee-stained client presentation, one missed birthday party, one tired but proud evening at a time. And I made peace with the fact that while no one in my family ever celebrated that win, like they had celebrated Nina's first gallery opening, I did. And maybe that was enough. That apartment didn't just give me shelter, it gave me proof that I could create stability without shortcuts, that I could build something meaningful, even when no one else saw the value, which is why when my parents casually announced over dinner that Nina would be moving into my spare room, it didn't just feel intrusive. It felt like erasure, because what they saw as just a room, I saw as my reward. And as I sat there nodding politely, letting the pot roast go cold on my plate, I realized something quietly powerful. This wasn't about real estate. This was about respect, and whether I was finally ready to demand it. And the truth is, I wasn't sure yet, but I knew this. I couldn't go back to being invisible in the home I built with my own hands. Next came the moment that would test everything I thought I had learned about boundaries. Not a dramatic fight, just a family dinner, and one quiet sentence that would change everything. It wasn't the first time they'd made decisions for me without asking. But this time, it wasn't about what I wore to a cousin's wedding or which side dish I should bring to Thanksgiving. It was my home. My name on the lease, my groceries in the fridge. And still, my parents sat at the dinner table, sipping red wine, mapping out Nina's temporary stay like they were booking a hotel room. I didn't know I was running. They spoke with the certainty of people who believed their intentions were too loving to require permission. I remember my mother's smile, soft but strategic. "You're always so generous, Elena, and you're hardly ever home during the week, right?" My father added, "Family helps family," as if that single phrase overrode personal space, emotional labor, and lease agreements. Meanwhile, Nina barely looked up from her phone. She didn't need to. The plan was already made. My silence was being interpreted as consent again. Growing up, this was the pattern. My decisions were optional, my feelings negotiable. When I was 16, they volunteered me to babysit my cousins all summer after the schedule was already printed. In college, they handed out the keys to my studio apartment to distant relatives without checking in. It's just for a weekend, they'd say. Every choice made for me in the name of being helpful, of being part of the family, and every time I complied, I taught them I didn't need to be asked. The lesson here was clear, but it came late. If you don't name your boundaries, someone else will name them for you. And they'll call it love. That night, as I drove home from the dinner table that doubled as a boardroom, I stared out at the city lights and thought, this isn't about being nice. It's about being seen. I had nodded too many times. I had smiled through too many decisions that weren't mine. And this time, I wasn't going to nod. I wasn't going to smile. Because next, I would remember how easily just for a while becomes forever, and how quickly love without limits can feel like loss without permission. Just for a while, those words should come with a disclaimer. In my family, they were the opening act to something far more permanent. I'd heard them before so many times that they became a quiet chorus in my memory. When Nina moved back home after dropping out of art school, it was just until she found clarity. 2 years, 3 boyfriends, and 1 failed Etsy store. Later, her things still occupied the guest room. When my uncle stayed in our basement just until his knee healed, he ended up living there for 8 months, and nobody ever asked how his knee was doing again. These weren't isolated cases. They were part of a family rhythm, one that moved to the beat of emotional emergencies, disguised as temporary needs that always somehow became someone else's long-term responsibility. And the truth was, Nina had never really been told to stand on her own because someone always made room. I wasn't angry at her. I was frustrated with the system that trained her to expect space and me to surrender it. Here's the thing, permanence doesn't always announce itself. It arrives in cardboard boxes that don't get unpacked furniture deliveries, made without warning and assumptions that your schedule and life will shift without protest. It wears the clothes of family, but it speaks the language of entitlement. The lesson: if you agree to just for a while without clarity, without timelines, without boundaries, it's not kindness. It's quiet consent. And once you hand over your piece without a clock ticking on its return, it's rarely given back freely. That night, as I stood in the room, they called spare, but I called my sanctuary. I looked at the desk where I'd built client reports and late-night dreams. I ran my hand over the bookshelves filled with research travel notes and reminders of who I was outside the roles they saw, and I thought, I've given enough of myself in silence. If they want my space, they'll have to face my terms. Next came the real question, not whether I would say no, but whether I believed I had the right to. And for that, I'd have to revisit the story of the middle child, the peacemaker, and the girl who never wanted to be a burden. Being the middle child isn't just a birth order. It's a job description no one applies for, but everyone expects you to fulfill. You're the bridge, the translator, the emotional airbag in every collision between the strong-willed oldest and the sensitive youngest. In my case, my brother Aaron paved his way through law school with trophies and leadership awards. Nina floated through life with dreams, detours, and gentle landings usually padded by my parents. Me, I learned how to not need much. That was my role, the one who managed, the one who coped. Middle children often get praised for being so mature or so reliable, but that praise is a velvet trap. It teaches you that your value lies in making things easier for others. So you become the one who drives the carpool, remembers birthdays, stays late at work, and nods politely, even when your own needs are ignored. You become fluent in sacrifice without ceremony. I realized sitting in my apartment that week how often I had downplayed my own discomfort just to keep things smooth. I thought about the countless times I deferred to Aaron's schedules, Nina's crises, or my parents' requests, all for the sake of peace. But peace that requires your silence is not peace, it's pressure in disguise. And here's the painful truth: when you're always the bridge, you learn how to carry weight that isn't yours. Until one day it cracks. Not from anger, but from quiet exhaustion. And that crack becomes the beginning of clarity. So as I reread my father's message about clearing out space and my mother's cheerful texts about parking passes, I didn't just see a demand. I saw a pattern that had taught me over decades to surrender first and process later. The next step wasn't going to be easy, but it had to start with a simple, radical act, naming the boundary I'd never felt allowed to speak aloud. There's a quiet shift that happens when you realize boundaries aren't walls, they're blueprints. Not tools for pushing people away, but frameworks for building relationships where respect has room to breathe. I used to think saying no meant I was failing my family, that it meant I didn't love them enough. But my therapist Jenna once asked me a question that changed everything. What if love without boundaries isn't love at all, just obligation in costume? That stuck with me. So I started planning. Not an outburst, not a confrontation, a plan, calm, legal, clear. I reread my lease and discovered something reassuring: long-term guests had to be approved by building management and couldn't stay beyond 14 days without documentation. It wasn't just a boundary I wanted, it was one the building already supported. Then I thought about Derek, a colleague whose condo was undergoing repairs, responsible, trustworthy, and most importantly, unknown to my family. I floated the idea of him subletting for 2 weeks. He agreed, grateful for the timing. We signed the necessary paperwork and submitted it to the office. Quiet steps, no shouting, just structure. The beauty of this moment was realizing that boundaries aren't battles, they're instructions. They tell others this is how to care for me, and more importantly, they tell you how to care for yourself. I knew there would be backlash. Emotional weather is always unpredictable when family patterns are disrupted. But this time, I wouldn't meet it with apologies. I'd meet it with preparation. I didn't owe anyone my space. I owed myself my voice. Next came the test. The day my family would arrive at my door, unaware of the blueprint I had quietly drawn beneath their assumptions. And this time, I'd be ready. The morning air felt strangely still. Not silent, but paused, like the whole city was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. I sat in my hotel room, coffee and handphone on silent, and eyes fixed on the live feed from my apartment's security camera. The timestamp blinked 10:59 a.m. They were right on time. At 11:03, my father appeared on screen, his usual calm replaced with tight impatience. Behind him, my mother held a clipboard, probably the moving checklist, and Nina, phone in hand, looked more distracted than distressed. When the door didn't open, the knocking began, then the bell. Then my dad pulling out his phone, likely calling building management, just as I had expected. I watched as Derek opened the door, mug of tea in one hand. Posture relaxed, he didn't raise his voice. He simply explained that he was the legal occupant with paperwork filed and verified. The confusion on their faces was almost surreal. My mother's hands flew to her chest, a move she reserved for drama she hadn't scripted. My father leaned in as if authority could override a signature, but the building security officer already present calmly stepped between them and the threshold. That door didn't just stay locked, it spoke. It said, "Not this time, not like this." There's something powerful about watching your own story shift from powerlessness to presence. I wasn't behind the door, but my boundary was. And for once, it didn't bend. It didn't explain. It simply existed, firm and clear. The messages came in like a flood afterward. Missed calls, voicemails edged with rage, texts from Rachel layered with guilt and disbelief. Even my aunt, the perennial peacekeeper, chimed in with a disappointed, "We just didn't expect this from you." But I didn't respond. The lesson echoed gently in that quiet hotel room. Sometimes the strongest statement isn't what you say, it's what you don't undo. And as the afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the floor, I realized this wasn't the end of the storm, it was only the eye. The backlash would come next. But so would something else, the unshakable clarity of a woman who had finally learned how to hold her ground. When the door stayed closed, the storm didn't end. It simply changed shape. Gone were the pounding fists and sharp demands. What followed was quieter, more cunning. Guilt trickled in like water through a cracked window, slow, persistent, and oddly familiar. My phone buzzed with messages that didn't ask how I was, they questioned who I had become. "This isn't like you, Elena," my mother said in a voicemail soaked with disbelief. "You've always been the thoughtful one." It stung. Because that wasn't entirely wrong. I had always been the thoughtful one. But somewhere along the way, being thoughtful had been twisted into being available emotionally, physically, logistically, whenever someone else needed me. And when I finally stepped back, it didn't feel like empowerment. It felt like betrayal. Not theirs, mine. That's the tricky thing about setting boundaries in a family that confuses closeness with control. You're not just saying no to a request, you're rewriting an entire unspoken agreement. The silence that followed my resistance was heavy. No more group chats, no weekend dinner invites, just space and uncertainty. But something else came with it too, relief. Then a flicker of something I didn't expect. A text from Ethan, my younger brother, the one who usually stayed out of everything. "Not sure what went down," he wrote, "but honestly, proud of you." Sometimes a single message can crack open a window when a dozen others try to shut a door. That one meant the world. Not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me the story wasn't over. It was changing. And just as the tension settled into the bones of the family, I'd always known a new possibility emerged, a conversation that had never happened before. One where we wouldn't just assign roles, but finally ask, "What do you need?" That conversation would come next, over coffee in neutral territory with new terms, not of war, but of respect. We met at a small cafe halfway between my apartment and my parents' house. I chose it carefully neutral ground, quiet music, no risk of raised voices echoing against kitchen tile. I arrived early, ordered a cappuccino, and picked a table by the window. My hands were steady, but my heart beat like I was walking into a negotiation I hadn't fully prepared for. Because in a way I was. They arrived together, my mother, my father, and Nina. No one spoke right away. My mom placed her purse on the chair as if trying to claim familiarity. My dad ordered black coffee, his usual armor of silence. Nina looked smaller than I remembered, eyes tired, shoulders curled inward. She didn't meet my gaze at first. It was my father who broke the silence. "I think we need to talk about what happened last weekend," he said, trying to sound calm but firm. I nodded. "Actually, I think we need to talk about what's been happening. For years." What followed wasn't easy. I told them how their pattern of decisions about my time, my space, my life had slowly chipped away at the foundation of our trust. I explained that boundaries weren't barriers, but bridges, not a way to push them out, but to keep our connection honest and balanced. My mother fidgeted with her napkin. "We just thought you'd want to help," she said. I smiled gently. Wanting to help and being expected to say yes without being asked are not the same thing. To my surprise, Nina spoke next. "They told me it was all settled." "I didn't know you hadn't agreed." Her voice was low, but the sincerity was clear. It hit me sometimes the people we think are demanding are just following someone else's script. That's when something shifted. My dad, not usually one for soft words, finally looked me in the eye. "You're right. We should have talked to you first. We overstepped." It wasn't a grand apology, but it was more than I'd ever heard. A start, a new kind of conversation. We didn't draft anything formal, but that day we made an unspoken agreement, a new family contract. One that included space for mutual respect, one where love didn't assume it asked, one where my voice wasn't a disruption, but a necessary part of the dialogue. And as we stood to leave, my mother touched my arm, not to pull me close, but to pause. "Next time we plan anything," she said softly, "we'll check with you first." The next chapter wasn't about confrontation. It would be about learning how to rebuild, not with silence, but with sincerity. Not with obedience, but with understanding. And that process would begin not at my doorstep, but around the corners of everyday life. One mindful moment at a time. Healing didn't come in a single sweeping gesture. It came in fragments, small, sometimes awkward, but unmistakably real. Like the time my mom called before stopping by, her voice a little unsure, asking, "Is this a good time?" Just that, a question, not an assumption. Or when my dad forwarded me an article about a data analytics firm expanding into renewable energy. "Thought this might interest you," he wrote. No lecture, no favor asked, just curiosity, quiet, respectful human. Even Nina began reaching out in new ways. She texted one afternoon, "Want to grab lunch? Just us." At first, I hesitated. The old pattern would have made that lunch feel like a setup. But we met anyway, and to my surprise, she talked less about herself and more about what she was learning. "I started seeing someone," she said, "a therapist. I think I'm starting to understand how much I've relied on other people to fix things for me." That confession stayed with me. Because it wasn't just growth for her, it was a mirror for me. We were both shedding roles we'd been assigned too young. I wasn't just the reliable one anymore, and she wasn't just the emotional one. We were learning to meet in the middle, not as symbols of a broken family system, but as people trying to do better. The lesson progress is rarely loud. It's found in the pauses when someone asks, instead of assumes, when someone listens without interrupting, when space is given freely, not taken for granted. These were the moments that mattered most. Not because they solved everything, but because they signaled a shift. And slowly our family's language began to change. Not fluent yet, but fluent enough to try. And as we tiptoed through this quieter season of understanding, I realized something important: rebuilding trust didn't require erasing the past. It just needed a new kind of foundation, one laid with mutual care, patience, and permission. That foundation would face its first big test soon, when the holidays arrived. And with them, all the traditions, tensions, and invitations that once felt like obligations. This time, though, I'd bring something new to the table choice. The first time I protected my space felt like a revolution. The second time, it felt like maintenance. Because here's what I've learned: boundaries aren't one-time declarations, they're daily practices. Like brushing your teeth or locking your door, not dramatic, but essential. My apartment, once just a personal victory, had become something more, a symbol of self-respect. But that respect needed upkeep. The holidays rolled around, and with them came the annual family dance. My mother called early November, her voice tentative but warm. "We'd love to host Christmas again this year, but if you'd rather stay in, we understand." It took me a moment to recognize what had changed, not just the offer, but the option. I chose to attend bringing a side dish, not a suitcase of emotional labor. And when my mom asked if I could host Easter next year, I smiled and said, "That doesn't work for me, but I'm happy to help in other ways." No guilt, no spiral, just a calm, clear answer. This, I realized, was the real transformation. Not that my family had become perfect or that old habits didn't sometimes resurface. But now I had tools, language, limits, and the courage to use them without flinching. The lesson: your sanctuary isn't just a physical place, it's your time, your attention, your peace. And protecting it isn't selfish. It's how you make sure the parts of yourself you fought to build don't slowly dissolve into someone else's comfort zone. Months later, as I returned home from a quiet evening walk, I paused at my apartment door. Door, same bricks, but everything felt different. Not because the space had changed, but because I had. I stepped inside and exhaled. This wasn't just a place I lived. It was the space I had claimed again and again, with boundaries that didn't push people away but taught them how to stay. And in that space, I discovered something I hadn't expected. When you protect what matters to you, you don't lose love. You teach it how to grow. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the tension of loving your family while still needing space to breathe, I want you to know you're not alone. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you're cold, distant, or difficult. It means you're finally allowing yourself to be whole. Have you ever had to draw a line to protect your peace? Share your experience in the comments. I read everyone, and you never know who your story might help feel seen. If you found value in this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. We have more stories ahead, real, raw, and rooted in the kind of growth that comes from choosing yourself without apology. Because healing isn't always loud, but it's always worth sharing.